Welcome, dear listener, to Sleepy Historian, where the stories are soft, the sounds are ambient, and the pace is deliciously slow. You're here now. You've made it. So settle in. Unclench your jaw. Loosen your shoulders. Let the light around you dim just a little more. If your eyelids feel heavy, let them close. This channel is your quiet haven for boring history for sleep, for soft-spoken historical documentaries, for the kind of storytelling and ambient sounds that gently pull you away from a noisy world and into a gentler one, rich with calm bedtime storytelling and rhythm slow enough to lull your thoughts into sleep. You're not alone. There are thousands of listeners, from quiet bedrooms in Chicago to lamplit porches in Vermont, falling asleep to boring history each night. Some of them love Roman history, others medieval food, and tonight we whisper about something tender and strange. Let's talk about love. More precisely, how people proposed marriage in the Middle Ages. Now, before your mind fills with violins and diamond rings, pause. Because the medieval world did things differently. Quietly, often awkwardly, sometimes with a sheep. There were no candlelit dinners, no nervous "will you marry me?" on bended knee in a Paris cafe. Instead, there were barterings, tokens, bundles of herbs. Marriage was practical, a social and financial contract. But that doesn't mean it lacked emotion. It had its own strange tenderness. Whispered promises in corners of abbey courtyards, secret exchanges of gloves or belts, and handwritten love notes on linen paper. And that's the world we'll wander into tonight. You'll hear about the customs of courtship in dusty English villages. We'll drift into smoky great halls where lords negotiated dowries. We'll tiptoe past the shy glances in monastery orchards. And we'll listen in on the quiet beats of hearts in a time long before texting or Tinder. So let's slow down together. You're not expected to stay awake for all of it. You're invited to drift in and out, to get cozy under your blanket, to breathe a little deeper. This is a history sleep story, a soft history documentary made for bedtime relaxation, a slow meander through traditions, secrets, and affection as they unfold in the distant past. Let's begin. Let us begin not with the ring, nor the words, "will you marry me?" but far before that, where proposals were quietly shaped by daily life. Imagine yourself in a small village nestled along a forest edge. It's a place where mornings begin with the slow creak of wooden shutters and the faint scent of hearth smoke curling into the air. Chickens cluck softly in a thatched yard. The rhythm of daily life is measured in chores, sun angles, and bells tolling from the chapel tower. It's a world where time moves slowly. Not because life was easier, but because everything took time. Hauling water, kneading dough, spinning wool, waiting for news to arrive by horse or foot. In this world, love was not found on a screen or in a flash of admiration at a bar or cafe. Love emerged slowly through shared glances over loaves of bread or conversations during walks to market. You see, in the medieval world, particularly in the 12th to 15th centuries, courtship wasn't just a private affair. It was often a communal and deeply ritualized process, wrapped in custom, tradition, and necessity. For peasant folk, a young man might help the father of a potential bride harvest his barley or mend his roof, not out of obligation, but as a quiet sign of interest, a kind of labor as flirting. The woman, meanwhile, might offer man a baked treat, woven token, or embroidered handkerchief, stitched slowly and carefully by firelight. These were not just romantic gestures, they were signals. Courtship in these times had rhythms like planting and harvesting, slow beginnings, signs of growth, seasons of waiting. There were few secrets in a village, and proposals, when they finally came, were often preceded by weeks or months of these tiny, ordinary exchanges. And let's not forget the role of family and the wider community. A father might offer a nod of approval, or a grandmother might gently whisper advice about good stock and kind hands. Neighbors might begin to comment softly that they look well together, nudging the romance forward with quiet communal assent. Even festivals and feast days played a role in courtship. On May Day or during a harvest festival, games, dances, and shared meals offer opportunities to spend time together, laughing over spilled ale or touching hands during a dance beneath flickering torchlight. These gentle moments built the bridge toward a proposal. But it wasn't all simple. For the working poor, the idea of proposing marriage was often tangled with survival. One needed land, tools, a roof, and sometimes permission. The church's growing influence also meant that formal marriage was becoming not just a social contract, but a sacrament, a union of not just bodies and property, but of souls under the eyes of heaven. Still, in the quieter hours, perhaps while walking home with a basket of eggs, or weaving wool by the fire, thoughts turned to love, to partnership, to what it meant to ask someone with simple sincerity to walk beside you for the rest of life. It wasn't showy, it wasn't Instagram worthy, but it was real. And in this slow, steady world, where the days stretched long and the stars told time, those feelings, like everything else, unfolded with patience. Soon, we'll explore how this blossomed into formal proposals, oaths, and even public declarations. But first, let's linger here, just a moment longer, among the slow heartbeat village where love was carried like a folded letter in one's pocket, worn thin by warmth and waiting. Now that we've lingered in the slow, silent rhythms of village life, let's move closer to the moment of asking. Because eventually, after all the small gestures and shared chores, after the feasts and dances and glances across the spinning wheel, came the question, not will you marry me, as you might know it. No, the words were different. The setting was different. And the very meaning of proposal held layers both legal and spiritual, spoken in churchyards, witnessed by neighbors, or whispered over fences. But first, imagine this. It's evening. The sky has shifted to the color of damp parchment. A boy, just barely a man, stands near the well, holding a carved wooden token, smooth by thumb and thought. A girl stands across from him, fingers curled around the edge of her apron. They have no audience, only the quiet of chickens roosting and smoke from the hearths. He does not kneel. That gesture is centuries away. Instead, he might offer the token, a spindle whorl, a lace bobbin, a belt clasp, something modest, handmade, and symbolic. And then he might say the words, "If you will have me," or "I will be yours if you'll be mine." These were simple phrases, known as words of present consent. And in many places in medieval Europe, those words, if witnessed, made the couple legally bound, even before a church ceremony. This form of informal marriage was called hand fasting in many regions, a joining of hands and promises, sometimes temporary, sometimes permanent. Two people declared their intent aloud, in each other's presence, and often with a witness. That was enough. Imagine how much weight rested in such a moment. No ring, no bended knee, just eye contact and the shared trust that these words, "I take you as mine," would be honored as deeply as a vow before God. And yet, there were rings too, though not for everyone. In wealthier households, rings became increasingly symbolic. A silver or bronze band might be passed from father to suitor, or from groom to bride. And in rare cases, these rings bore inscriptions, Latin phrases like "Amor vincit omnia," "Love conquers all," among nobility. Proposals were often more formal, but rarely more romantic. Instead of a private exchange, there might be contracts, dour negotiations, even political strategy. A knight might seek a lady's hand not out of affection, but out of alliance. Lands joined, fortunes merged, bloodlines preserved. Yet even among nobles, tenderness found a way in. A nobleman might commission a love poem. A lady might embroider a favor, a ribbon, a crest, a scarf, which the suitor wore on his arm during tournaments. Still, in both cottage and castle, the act of proposing, of asking, was something weighted, careful, often nervous, just as today. And for many women, saying yes was not the end. It was the beginning of another kind of vulnerability, because accepting a proposal could mean leaving family behind, moving into unfamiliar homes, bearing children quickly, adapting to in-laws, new labor, and the expectations of wifehood. In some regions, before accepting proposal, the woman would seek advice from her mother, a wise aunt, a midwife, or even a local priest. Together, they would weigh the suitor's reputation, his ability to provide, his kindness or lack of it. So no, it wasn't impulsive. It wasn't driven by butterflies. It was slow, cautious, often practical, but also deeply, quietly sincere. In the calm of a garden, by the glow of a fire, or at the edge of a meadow where flax bent gently in the breeze. The asking was done, and somewhere between the shared tokens, the whispered words, the clasped hands, a promise was made. Next, we'll step deeper into the heart of medieval love with traditions that followed the proposal. The weddings, the blessings, the ceremonies that transformed the promise into a lifelong bond. But before we go, let's pause here, in the breath between question and answer. In the quiet spaces between chores and chapel bells, between weaving and woodcutting, news had a way of traveling. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't printed. It was whispered. And among the most delicious whispers of all, a pending match, a proposal accepted, two hands clasped beneath the elder tree the night before. In medieval villages, life moved slowly, but information did not. A glance shared at the market could bloom into a rumor before sundown. A late-night visit between neighboring cottages was enough to start the spindle wheels spinning, not with thread, but with speculation. This was how love, or at least a hint of it, moved through a community, because marriage wasn't just a private affair. It was a community event, a matter of land, lineage, and labor. And so, once word spread that proposal had taken place or was imminent, everyone, it seemed, had an opinion. Mothers would gather near the communal bread ovens, trading theories while tending rising loaves. She'd do better with the blacksmith's son, one might whisper. She turned him down once already. Another would mutter, eyes glancing sideways. Teenagers listened. Children stared. Old men nodded, knowingly or wistfully, recalling their own offers long since accepted or declined. Even the local priest might weigh in, especially if the couple in question had been spotted speaking too fondly after Mass or loitering too long near the churchyard gate. And yet, for all the gossip, there was something protective about it. The community watched over its own, sometimes meddlesome, sometimes wise. A girl who accepted a proposal from a man known to drink too deeply or shout too loudly might find herself visited by an aunt or neighbor who'd seen too much life to stay silent. But when a match was celebrated, truly celebrated, it became the village's joy. There might be music from the traveling piper 2 weeks early, an extra pie baked, just in case guests dropped by, a ribbon tied around the well's handle or hung from a yew tree. Children practiced dances. Neighbors picked wildflowers. And somewhere, the betrothed sat in a patch of sunlight, wondering what the future might hold. Not wealth or ease, most likely, but warmth, company, shared winters, and maybe love. Even in townships where poverty pinched and hardships lingered, there was still celebration in a promise, still hope in a pairing. And so, the whisper of proposal became a thread, pulled gently through the loom of village life, stitched into stories that would be passed down, remembered, and eventually softened by time. You might be asleep already, And that's okay. But if not, imagine that thread pulled through rough linen, whispered from mouth to ear, stitched into memory. Because tomorrow there will be a wedding to prepare. And next we will walk through that day. Imagine now that the village melts away. The cobbled streets, the bread ovens, the gossip, they all soften into mist. And rising through the haze, stone, high towers, echoing chambers, embroidered tapestries that move slightly in the chill. You're in a medieval castle, a place not of whispers, but of contracts, not of courting glances, but negotiated futures. Because while villagers propose with wooden tokens and private promises, the nobility propose with parchment and bloodlines. Here, love was not the starting point. It was a luxury, something that might grow later, if at all. Let us walk through one such story. The betrothal of Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of medieval Europe's most influential and controversial women. Born in the early 12th century, Eleanor inherited vast lands and immense power. At just 15 years old, she was married to Louis VII of France, not because they danced under the stars or whisper behind tapestries, but because their union meant the joining of France's royal crown and Aquitaine's treasure-rich lands. Their engagement wasn't discussed in the kitchen. It was negotiated over scrolls and sealed with wax. Clergymen advised. Nobles approved. The Pope himself blessed it. And Eleanor, she rode in a litter to Paris, cloaked in velvet, her future written in ink before she could speak a word. This was a reality for many noble women, especially those of powerful families. Proposals came not with surprises, but with strategic planning, sometimes from the moment a girl was born. Her dowry, land, gold, or castles, was measured, bartered, and used to attract suitors who could strengthen alliances or settle disputes. In some cases, children were engaged as toddlers. A noble boy of 6 might be pledged to a girl of 3. The match celebrated with feasts, but delayed until the proper age. Yet the promise, once made, was binding. Such engagements could shift the balance of kingdoms. They ended wars, sparked others. In 1469, Isabella of Castile married Ferdinand of Aragon, uniting 2 powerful realms in what would become Spain. Their marriage was not only a romantic success. They ruled side by side and were deeply devoted, but also a political maneuver that changed European history. So, what did a noble proposal look like? It often began with envoys, trusted messengers sent between courts. They carried letters, gifts, even portraits. Negotiations followed. What would the bride bring? What would the groom offer in return? Would the bride be crowned? Where would she live? Eventually, an agreement would be reached. A ceremony might take place immediately, or a betrothal ring might be exchanged first, a symbol of intention, but not yet marriage. Sometimes, the couple didn't meet until wedding day. Imagine it, you're 15. A crown waits on a velvet pillow, and the man you will marry stands beside you, unknown, yet already bound to you by weeks of negotiation and centuries of expectation. Still, within this formality, there were moments of quiet humanity. A young bride might sneak a glance at her future husband. A prince might smile as he accepted her hand, grateful for her beauty, or for her calm demeanor in the face of ceremony. A mother might whisper advice into her daughter's ear moments before the vows. It's easy to imagine cold halls and cold hearts, but remember, people are people, and even in the grandest castle, the moment of proposal, though draped in silk and politics, still carried a trembling question. Will this be a life of respect, of companionship, of kindness, or simply one of obligation? Next, we'll explore one such noble wedding in vivid detail. Its rituals, its extravagance, and the layers of meaning stitched into every candle and crown. But for now, listen to the echo of footsteps in the stone corridor. A princess walks, cloaked in velvet, toward a future that has already been decided. Imagine the morning. The castle is not yet fully awake, but the fires are already lit. In the stone-walled kitchens, servants stir thick pots of spice wine. In the great hall, rushes are being replaced, trampled ones swept aside and replaced with fresh herbs, lavender, rosemary, meadowsweet, crushed underfoot to release their calming scent. The air is cool, fragrant, and electric with anticipation. Today is a royal wedding, not a quiet affair like in the village chapel, nor an informal promise under a tree. This is ceremony, with all its ritual and precision. Let us stay with Eleanor of Aquitaine again. Or, if you prefer, imagine an unnamed noble bride. She is young, perhaps 16, and today she becomes a queen or nearly one. She does not dress herself. Handmaidens help her step into layers of linen and silk. Her undergown is simple, but over goes a gown of scarlet or deep blue, the colors of wealth, dyed with rare materials. Gold embroidery lines the sleeves. Pearls sewn in a row along the neckline. Over all, a cloak trimmed in fur, possibly ermine if her station allows. Her hair, washed the day before with a mixture of herbs and egg yolk, is coiled in a complex braid or twisted into a jewel caul, a kind of golden cage for the hair. On her fingers, rings gifted by her family, each one symbolic, protective, decorative. Before she leaves her chamber, she kneels. A prayer for strength, for peace, for favor. Or maybe just a moment to breathe. Downstairs, guests are arriving. Noblemen from distant provinces. Clergy in fine vestments. Pages leading teams of horses. Carts of wine. Bolts of linen and crates of dried fruits. Everyone is dressed in their finest. Shoes shined. Beards combed. Jewels flashing in candlelight. In the chapel, the priest prepares the altar. A wedding in the Middle Ages is not just a social event. It's a sacrament, a sacred contract. And though arranged and politically motivated, the church sees marriage as holy, a bond not only of two people, but of two souls before God. The ceremony begins not with a march, but with a blessing. The couple meets at the church doors, a powerful symbol, for it marks the beginning of their life together. Outside they are separate. Inside they are joined. The bride may be veiled. The groom may wear a tunic bearing his family's crest. Their hands are joined, right hand to right hand, and a priest may wrap a ribbon or stole around them, binding them as one. This is where the phrase, tying the knot, originates. They are asked if they come freely. They vow to remain faithful. They promise to support each other in sickness, in health, in poverty, in fortune. A ring is blessed, usually of gold, and slipped onto the bride's finger, not always the left hand. In some regions, the right was considered more appropriate. The ring is circular, symbolizing eternity. The ceremony might conclude with a kiss or a simple nod. Applause is rare. This is not a performance. It is a rite. Afterward, they step inside the church. A mass is held. Prayers for fertility, for happiness, for protection. Then comes the feast. Tables are laid out in long rows. Banners hang from the rafters. Music fills the air. Lutes, flutes, perhaps a psaltery. Dancers might perform, jesters entertain, poets recite. But the food, the food. Roasted meats, stews with cinnamon and cloves, pies shaped like animals, sweet custards and honeyed almonds, bread as soft as linen, crusted with salt, and wine, red, white, sometimes mulled with orange peel and anise. The bride and groom sit on a raised dais. They are toasted, gifted, occasionally teased. There is laughter, but also decorum. This is still court. Every guest is watching, every gesture observed, every smile interpreted. By nightfall, the couple retires, not in privacy, but often observed by select witnesses. to ensure the marriage is consummated. This, too, was part of contract. And then the door closes, and behind that heavy wood, with firelight flickering against the stone walls, the politics melt away, the feast fades, and the two young people sit, suddenly alone, possibly for the first time. They speak quietly, share bread, try to imagine what tomorrow will look like, together, and as they rest, so do we. Next, we'll uncover the mysteries that surrounded medieval proposals, charms, omens, forbidden love, and tokens hidden in bread loaves. What stories weren't written into scrolls, but whispered around the fire. Now, let's leave the stone halls behind. Step away from gilded scrolls, velvet gowns, and noble contracts. Instead, follow a narrow trail beyond the castle's shadow, into the quiet lanes where superstition whispers more loudly than scripture and love blooms where it should not. For all the rules that govern medieval proposals, the arranged marriages, the dowries, the alliances, there were also secrets. Some couples did not wait for permission. Some lovers whispered vows by moonlight, exchanged tokens beneath chapel ruins, or wove meaning into everyday objects. A folded ribbon, a carved spoon, a coin pressed with breath and placed under a pillow. There is something timeless, after all, in the desire to mark affection with ritual, especially when you're forbidden to. Herb love charms and secret signs. In many villages across Europe, a young woman might wear a love charm to attract a suitor. These weren't glamorous potions in glass bottles. They were modest, handmade, and deeply symbolic. One common item was a lover's knot, tied from grass, string, or even the threads of an old garment. It might be slipped into the path of a desired suitor or hidden in his satchel. There were also bread charms, small tokens of affection or intention, baked into loaves and delivered as casual gifts. If a young man bit into bread and found a carved heart or button inside, he might understand its meaning, or he might not. Milkmaids, herbalists, and widows often carried the knowledge of folk love magic, passed down not in books, but in whispers and careful gestures. A girl might brush the sleeve of a boy's tunic on May Day and pluck a flower after. If he returned the flower, pressed and dried, by midsummer, it was seen as a promise. Hair, breath, and blood were often used in these folk traditions. A single strand of hair might be braided into a charm, a kiss blown into a locket, a small prick to the thumb mixed into wine, not for harm, but for binding. Some charms were more practical, like boiling rosemary and thyme together, to bathe one's hands before meeting a beloved. The scent, it was believed, encouraged sincerity and sweetness in speech. And yet, for all the magic, many of these acts were unspoken. A proposal in this context was not always formal. It might be an action, a ritual repeated every Sunday, a walk shared each evening, a piece of carved wood left in a shoe. It was in gesture, not just words. Locked forbidden love and risky proposals. Of course, not all love was allowed. Monks and nuns took vows of chastity. Widows were expected to remarry quickly, or never. Servants could not wed without their lord's permission, and marriages between classes were discouraged or outright forbidden. But hearts do not always listen. There are dozens of recorded ecclesiastical court cases, not criminal, but moral courts, where people were punished for clandestine marriage, meaning unions formed without church approval. A blacksmith might run off with a noble's daughter. A novice nun might sneak out at night to meet her lover beneath the apple trees. Two peasants might declare themselves married before witnesses, without ever stepping into a church. Sometimes these secret unions were later recognized by law, but not always. One popular tale tells of a shepherd boy and a baron's niece who met each morning by a stream. They exchanged letters, tokens, promises. When discovered, the girl was locked away, and the boy simply vanished. Some said he ran to the city. Others said he became a monk. Still others whispered that he drowned. By choice or by order, no one knew. But long after, travelers swore they could hear a flute playing at the stream's edge, even when no one stood there, whether true or not. Such tales linger for generations, warnings and comforts both. They reminded people that even in a time of rigid structure and hierarchy, love still found cracks to bloom through. Whether under a table, behind a curtain, or hidden in the folds of a bread loaf, proposals could be quiet rebellions, acts of courage and hope. So as you drift now, imagine them. The hand-carved tokens, the silk knots, the whispered promises beneath starry skies. Not every proposal was public. Not every ring came with blessing. But many were real. Many were brave. Many were remembered. Let's move now from the whispered tales and moonlit paths to the soil beneath your feet. Imagine centuries have passed. The lovers are long gone. Their children and grandchildren forgotten. The houses they lived in have turned to dust. But not everything is lost, because sometimes the ground keeps secrets, and sometimes archaeologists listen. In the fields of Europe, under the floors of ruined abbeys, in the cellars of crumbling manor homes, and along the edges of forgotten trade routes, small things are still being found. Rings, carved bones, metal brooches, tiny folded letters sealed with wax. Not treasure, just tokens. Things once held tightly in a closed fist, tucked away in a pouch, or sewn into the hem of a traveling cloak. They speak of love in all its ordinary and imperfect forms. The humble posy ring. Perhaps the most iconic medieval love token ever unearthed is the posy ring, spelled P-O-S-Y, from the word poesy or poem. These were simple gold bands, often unadorned on the outside, but inscribed on the inside with short messages. Eunice and Jemay, united forever. Je suis à vous, I am yours. My heart is thine. As I am hers, so she is mine. They were exchanged in secret, gifted by hand, hidden under gloves. Some were so small they could only have belonged to teenagers or very petite adults, reminding us that marriage for many began young. Hundreds of posy rings have been found by metal detectors across fields and rivers in England and France. Each discovery tells us more about private emotion in a very public time. Unlike the ornate jewels of nobility, these rings weren't meant to impress others. They were worn for meaning, not display. Envelope, folded notes, and sealed vows. A few archaeologists working in Germany and Switzerland have uncovered folded parchment notes, hidden in chimneys beneath floorboards or tucked between stones in old hearths. Some are love letters. Often they're only fragments. The name of a beloved, a drawn heart, a verse from a popular song. One such note found in a 15th century farmhouse read, "If God sees fit, we shall be one a harvest. My hand is yours if my father agrees." It was unsigned. The ink had faded, but it was folded with care, wrapped in a red thread, which in many European folk traditions signified a wish for binding, for fate to intervene. Dove, trinkets, tokens, and accidental gifts. Other proposals left behind no rings or words, just objects of intention. A pair of small carved wooden birds were found buried beside the threshold of a ruined village chapel in Normandy. One bird's wing was missing. The other had a heart carved into its belly. Historians believe they may have been part of a folk ceremony, gifted between two people before walking across the church threshold together. In coastal Scotland, a woman's grave was uncovered, her bones worn from labor, her teeth showing signs of malnutrition, and yet curled in her hand was a tiny iron key, too small to open any known lock. Some think it was symbolic, a key to a future promised, or simply a token from a loved one, left with her even in death. These objects don't shout, they whisper, and in those whispers, we learn something remarkable, that even hundreds of years ago, when life was short and survival uncertain, people still paused to mark their love, not with Instagram posts, not with glittering diamonds, but with a phrase etched in gold, a heart carved in wood, a song lyric folded and forgotten beneath a floorboard, evidence of feeling, still waiting patiently beneath the earth. It might seem strange to think of love as a business transaction, but in the Middle Ages, love, at least in terms of marriage, was very often just that, a legal arrangement and economic negotiation, a strategy to bind families, land, and legacy. And at the center of this complicated web stood the church. In medieval Europe, the church did not invent marriage, but it slowly took control of it. Over centuries, it transformed what had once been largely community-driven rituals into sacramental ceremonies with rules, regulations, and a fair amount of paperwork. Yet even with this growing formality, things remain surprisingly flexible in ways that might surprise you. Imagine a couple standing in the churchyard well before a wedding is planned. They might be holding hands, not for warmth, but as part of a legal act called a hand fasting. It wasn't just a gesture of affection. It was a binding vow, often spoken in front of witnesses, but not necessarily a priest. I plight thee my troth, they might say. And with those words, they were considered married, at least in the eyes of the community. For centuries, the church recognized clandestine marriages, meaning they didn't need to happen in church or be blessed by a priest to be valid. All that was required was mutual consent spoken aloud, and ideally, the presence of witnesses. Of course, the church didn't like this. Bishops and priests tried to discourage it, pushing instead for ceremonies to happen at the altar before God, and with the proper banns announced weeks in advance. But people were practical. Sometimes they couldn't afford a priest. Sometimes they couldn't wait. Sometimes they didn't want their parents to know. Marriage, after all, wasn't just emotional, it was financial. A proposal in many households meant the start of contract negotiations. Dowries were discussed, lands evaluated, and alliances weighed. For the nobility, marriages were tools of diplomacy. Carefully brokered deals that could secure borders, stop wars, or create powerful unions between noble houses. A teenage girl might be promised to a boy she had never met, based on the size of his father's estate. Records from 13th century France show detailed marriage contracts listing everything from sheep and candlesticks to entire mills and vineyards. And just like today, not all parties agreed. There were disputes. A suitor might break off an engagement after the dowry proved insufficient. A bride's family might withdraw if the groom's lands weren't as fertile as promised. Lawsuits were filed, promises made and broken. There were even medieval versions of prenups, carefully outlining what each person would retain if the marriage dissolved or if one partner died. Yet, for all this formality, proposals weren't always grand. Sometimes they were subtle, woven into daily routines. A father might mention a potential match over stew at supper. A mother might slip a coin into her daughter's apron and nod toward a boy at market. In merchant towns, love and business often intertwined. Two apprentices in the same guild might form a quiet bond, only acknowledged once their masters approved. There were also tokens of intent, often small and deeply personal. A length of ribbon passed through a girl's fingers before being given to a boy. A carved comb, a new pair of gloves, an especially symbolic gift, as gloves were associated with promises and protection. Even the act of sharing a meal, particularly sweets or wine, could be a gesture of affection with deeper meaning. And then there were the songs. Love songs, often set to simple tunes, traveled across towns and villages. They told tales of longing, betrayal, joy, and union. A well-known song in England described a miller's daughter who refused 3 wealthy suitors, but accepted the poor weaver who brought her a rose. That song wasn't just entertainment. It was instruction, passed down with rhythm and rhyme. Young people learned how to love, how to propose, and how to hope through the melodies sung by their elders. Inside churches, near the stone fonts and flickering candles, couples often made promises in secret. One might whisper vows behind a column. Another might press a hand to the cool stone wall, believing it bore witness. The sacred space lent a kind of protection, even to unblessed unions. And for those who did marry formally, the proposal was just the beginning. The engagement might last months or years, depending on age and resources. In that time, couples exchanged letters, gifts, and occasional meetings, always chaperoned, of course. And then, finally, the wedding, often a blend of legal formality, community celebration, and religious ritual. In the great cathedrals, weddings were quiet, almost somber. In village greens, they were raucous, filled with song, dancing, ale, and food. But regardless of where or how the vows were spoken, the intent behind them had been shaped long before, in whispered proposals, hand-carved gifts, and soft agreements made between families or secret hearts. These echoes remain, in parish records and dusty contracts, in love songs that still survive in oral tradition, and in the unearthed objects that, though silent, speak volumes. There's something haunting about the things we can't quite understand. In archaeology, not every discovery comes with an explanation. Sometimes, the past leaves us breadcrumbs, broken symbols, strange patterns, half-forgotten customs. And we're left to wonder. When it comes to proposals and love rituals in the Middle Ages, many such fragments remain. We may never fully know what they meant, but they hint at something tender and ancient and human. One example comes from a collection of small, carved stones found near the ruins of a chapel in Brittany, France. Each stone was about the size of a coin, smooth from river pebbles, etched with symbols of the moon, stars, and clasped hands. They were buried in a circular pattern under the threshold, not part of the chapel's foundation, but deliberately placed later. Some historians believe they were part of a folk betrothal ceremony, used by couples to symbolically lock in their promises. Perhaps they knelt together, stones in hand, whispering oaths to the sky. Perhaps the stones were buried together to ensure their love would take root. Nearby, archaeologists found a single lock of braided hair, wrapped in faded ribbon and tucked into a hollow stone. Was it part of a lover's ritual, a symbol of fidelity, or simply a keepsake from someone who never got the chance to say goodbye? We can only guess. And in that guessing, the story continues. In parts of rural Wales, oral traditions speak of the water whisper, a now-lost courting custom involving a stream, 2 leaves, and a question. 2 lovers would each place a leaf on the water's surface at opposite sides of the stream. If the leaves floated together and touched, their love was thought to be blessed. If they drifted apart, they were not meant to be. No objects survive from this tradition. No illustrations. Just a handful of mentions in 17th century folk songbooks and a few 19th century diaries. Yet the idea remains vivid, an intimate, almost childlike moment of quiet symbolism in a world otherwise ruled by rules. In the Austrian Alps, excavations of an isolated stone home uncovered a circle of worn wooden tokens, carefully arranged around a hearthstone. Each was carved with a different mark: a heart, a tree, a weaving pattern, a pair of boots. There were no written records, no names, just these simple symbols. The hearthstone was surrounded by ashes of long-burnt herbs, lavender, rosemary, and juniper. Scholars speculate the tokens may have been used in a household proposal ceremony, perhaps involving the sharing of promises or the weaving of shared futures. The pair of boots could symbolize journey, the tree growth, the weaving unity. But again, it's speculation. And yet these mysteries hold their own magic. They remind us that not all love stories were written down. Some were whispered into cold morning air. Some were danced in circles around bonfires. Some were pressed into clay, sung into lullabies, or carried on tokens that eventually crumbled into earth. and still others exist only in gestures that we no longer recognize. In a glance, a ribbon, a flower picked from the same place year after year. We might never know exactly what each object or tradition meant, but in their quiet presence, in their delicate preservation, buried in stone or passed down in song, we're reminded of something essential, that people long ago, just like us, reached out with hope. They risked rejection. They dreamed of warmth, of shared bread, of a life built not alone but together. And they marked that hope, not with grandeur, but with small, meaningful acts. A stone, a braid, a leaf, and that, in its own quiet way, is beautiful. Not all love stories in the Middle Ages were simple or tender. Some were wrapped in velvet and gold, shadowed by ambition and whispered behind palace doors. These were the romances of the elite, lords, ladies, kings, and queens, whose marriages rarely began with love, but often ended in legend. In the upper ranks of medieval society, marriage was never just about two people. It was a political contract, a military strategy, a tool for control. To propose marriage was to propose an alliance, and sometimes to provoke war. Let's imagine one such scene. It's the 12th century. A young noblewoman, perhaps 16, sits in a stone chamber high in a fortress. Her gown is embroidered, her hair brushed and perfumed. Below, a messenger waits, dusty from travel, holding a letter sealed with wax and bearing a crest not her own. She knows what's inside. The letter contains a marriage offer. It's not a surprise. Her father had mentioned the possibility at dinner the night before, casually, between bites of mutton and sips of wine. The man offering? A wealthy count from a neighboring region. Older, respected, widowed, with land. The girl has never met him. She may never meet him before the wedding. The proposal will be accepted or declined not by her, but by her father, possibly with the consultation of an uncle, a steward, or a bishop. Her feelings are not part of the negotiation. What matters is what comes with the groom. Land, soldiers, trade rights, political favor. This was common. Among the elite, marriage was too valuable to be left to chance. A single union could restructure an entire kingdom. One well-placed bride could bring dowries of cities, rivers, and troops. One clever marriage could seal peace or start a rebellion. Take, for example, Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and fascinating women of the medieval world. She was first married to King Louis VII of France, and after their marriage was annulled, she wed Henry Plantagenet, who became King Henry II of England. Her hand in marriage was not just desirable, it was strategic gold. By marrying her, Henry gained a massive portion of southern France, doubling his realm. The proposal likely came with scrolls, seals, terms, and troops. Eleanor herself was not passive. She was shrewd, opinionated, and politically savvy. But even she had to play by the rules, at least in appearance. Royal proposals were theater as much as they were negotiation. Some were arranged in candlelit council halls, others over hawking trips or during feasts. Offers were made with gifts, embroidered cloth, gem-encrusted belts, war horses. A prince might send a jeweled goblet or a finely painted miniature of himself to a foreign court, accompanied by a formal envoy. And always there were letters, long, florid letters, often written by scribes in Latin or French, full of flowery phrases and respectful titles. To the most virtuous lady of noble birth, they might begin. But make no mistake, this wasn't sentiment. It was politics disguised in poetry. Of course, love was not absent. Occasionally it bloomed. Historical records mention forbidden romances between pages and noble daughters. Hidden notes passed in hymnals, meetings in moonlit gardens. There's even mention in 14th century court records of a lady who refused 3 royal proposals, insisting she would only marry for love. Her estate was eventually seized, and she vanished from the records, but her story lingers in ballads. There were also the scandalous proposals. A king might propose to a woman far beneath his station. A noble widow might propose to a knight without a title. These were rarely accepted, at least publicly, but they suggest that behind the layers of protocol and formality, real emotion stirred. Even among the elite, hearts sometimes overrule crowns. And then there were arranged child marriages, often agreed upon when both bride and groom were still infants. These proposals were contracts signed and sealed years before either child could walk. The betrothal would be announced with ceremony. Gifts would be exchanged, and the children, when old enough, would be wed regardless of desire. For the elites, love often came after marriage, if it came at all, and yet in their letters, their diaries, their portraits and prayers, we sometimes catch glimpses of tenderness. A necklace kept long after a husband's death, a poem copied into a psalter, a ring worn to bed each night. These details whisper feelings that survived, even flourished, within marriages that began in boardrooms. Even amid silk and armor, parchment and politics, the hope for connection endured, just like the poorest peasant girl whispering a prayer to the river. In the world of lords and ladies, where marriages were arranged by councils and alliances drawn with ink rather than affection, love had to find a way to speak quietly, subtly, between the lines. And so was born a strange and beautiful tradition, the language of courtly love. It wasn't always about marriage. In fact, it rarely was. Courtly love lived in glances and gestures, poems and praise, rules and riddles. It thrived in castles and cloisters, at banquets and tourneys, in the corners of gardens and behind curtained windows. It was a game, and a dangerous one. Imagine yourself in a candlelit chamber, where a noble woman sits at her embroidery frame. A knight enters, not boldly, but with practiced restraint. He bows low. He does not touch her hand, nor meet her eyes directly. Instead, he speaks a single sentence, deliberately chosen. She replies with a verse, maybe something from Crétin de Troyes, or from a troubadour song. The words carry layers of meaning. This was a poetic dance of desire, played out in a world where marriages were transactions, and romance had to be invented, not to change fates, but to soothe them. Courtly love had its own rules, documented in 12th century texts like Andreas Capellanus de Amore. These rules dictated who could love whom, how messages would be sent, what was too forward, what was too cold. It was a code of longing, wrapped in etiquette. Knights often expressed their feelings through acts of devotion, wearing a lady's colors during a tournament, carving her initials into a tree, writing verses dedicated to her virtues, real or imagined, and in return, the lady might reward the knight with a favor, a glove, a ribbon, a brooch, something small enough to tuck into a tunic, and secret enough to feel sacred. The poems of this time were tender, dramatic, and full of metaphor. Love was likened to a wound, a flame, a battlefield, or even a prison. One famous verse reads, "Love holds me captive, though no chains I see. Her glance alone has shackled me." These lines would be sung softly in chambers or written into personal books. Some were even carved into panels on bed frames or into the margins of psalters. Sacred texts made more sacred, perhaps by the inclusion of mortal longing. And there were secret languages too. Some lovers used heraldic symbols to communicate. A red rose meant passion. A swan signaled fidelity. A sparrow might mean a secret tryst. Letters were sometimes hidden in the folds of cloaks or baked into pies, like something from a folk tale. Others developed private codes, like the love alphabet, assigning gestures of letters or tapping patterns on a tabletop during dinner. Imagine a knight tapping his fingers 3 times, then 2, then 1. She would know what he meant, even with a hall full of guests. And then there were games. Courtly love was sometimes practiced as a challenge, with nobles forming love courts, mock trials where participants debated questions like, is it better to love passionately and suffer, or to love lightly and be content? Judges, usually noble ladies, would decide, offering judgments as serious as if they were settling land disputes. These weren't legal matters, of course, but they allowed the elite to explore the idea of romance in a controlled, performative way. What makes all this so fascinating is that it was largely imaginary. Many of these lovers never intended to be together in reality. Marriage was off the table, but the feeling of love, the thrill of it, was something they could claim through stories, poetry, and performance. Some did take it further. Illicit affairs blossomed behind arras curtains and in castle gardens. Sometimes they ended in scandal or even execution, but more often they lived quietly in ink and parchment, in unspoken gestures passed in noble halls. In a world ruled by contracts, inheritance, and duty, courtly love was a whisper rebellion, a space where affection could breathe, even if only in verse. In the grand tapestry of medieval courtship, stitched with rituals, laws, and spectacle, is often the quietest gestures that linger longest. These are not the proposals written into treaties or painted into portraits. They are the invisible threads, the clasped hands beneath banquet tables, the embroidered initials in the lining of a cloak, the love notes slipped behind altar cloths during Mass. These are the final, gentle echoes of how people loved in a world that so often refused them permission. Picture a noblewoman, nearing 40, long since married to a lord she rarely sees. She tends to her household, manages servants, orders spices and tapestries. But every Thursday evening, she walks alone to the chapel and lights a single candle beside the tomb of a knight who once served in her father's household, a man who was said to sing to her beneath her window in the years before her wedding. There is no record of their relationship, no letters, no scandal, but the candle glows week after week, year after year. In another town, a master of the mint carries a silver brooch in the shape of a lily. It's slightly dented, well-worn. When asked about it, he claims it was a gift from his mother, but an old letter found years later, folded behind a wall panel, reveals it was given to him by the daughter of a noble family who once stayed at his father's manor during a plague outbreak. They spent one summer walking the orchard paths, speaking in low tones. She carved her initials into a walnut tree near the edge of the property. When she left the brooch behind. He wore it every day until his death. These stories, fragments really, come to us not from chronicles or ballads, but from account books, estate records, abbey inventories, and graffiti etched into monastery walls. One such discovery was made in a medieval manor undergoing restoration in the 20th century. Behind a chimney, tucked into a hollow beam, restorers found a dried posy of herbs and flowers, lavender, sage, and a withered red rose, wrapped in a piece of parchment. Written in delicate Latin were the words, "To my heart, hidden from the world." It was a sign. Even among royalty, quiet love left its mark. King Edward I of England, famously stern and often at war, was known to deeply love his wife, Eleanor Castile. After her death, he had memorial crosses erected across England, one at every stop her funeral procession made. He mourned her for the rest of his life. Their marriage, unusually, had grown into affection. In one surviving letter, he writes simply, "I miss your voice in the garden." The detail is small, the sentiment profound. Love, in the Middle Ages, was not always about fireworks or rebellion. Sometimes it was about endurance. A shared glance across a crowded hall, a letter never sent, a song hummed under breath, the scent of rosemary on a sleeve. These were the real proposals, the ones never spoken aloud, the ones remembered without being recorded. They flicker like candlelight in the quiet corners of history. Not bright enough to illuminate the whole room, but enough to make out the shape of something real, something tender, something enduring. Even in the coldest castles, a little warmth lingered. And now, dear listener, the last flicker of candlelight softens. The parchment has been read. The hall falls quiet, and the echoes of ancient hearts grow faint once more. You've walked with us through bustling villages and silent chapels, through marriage feasts and secret gardens, across castle halls and the pages of forgotten poems. Together, we've glimpsed the many forms that love and proposals once took. Not grand, always, not public, not easy, but real and deeply, unmistakably human. Imagine yourself now in a world slowed by time. The rush of modern life has stilled. The streetlights are gone. There's only the soft creak of a wooden bench beneath you, the gentle scent of herbs drying from the rafters above, and a faint memory, not your own, floating through the hush. How people proposed marriage in the past. They did so with tokens and riddles, glances and risks, oaths and hopes, stitched into sleeves and scratched into stone. Some of these proposals became legends. Others were lost the moment they were made. But all of them, in their quiet, faltering way, whispered the same simple truth. I see you. I choose you. Even here. Even now. As a sleepy historian, I thank you for letting me guide you through this gentle journey into the slower, softer corners of the past. We believe in the comfort of boring history, in the warmth of soft-spoken storytelling, and in the magic of falling asleep to ambient sounds of time long gone. If your eyes are heavy now, let them close. Let the stories float behind your dreams, and the distant footsteps of the past lull you deeper still. Until next time, sleep well and dream slowly.